Hello everyone, good morning and welcome to the inaugural Paxton Chadwick Commemorative Lecture, which is being launched by Communist Party East of England District. I'd like to thank you for putting aside your valuable time and dialing in for this webinar today. My name is Mark Jones and I'm your host. Just a tiny bit of housekeeping. I'm sure you're all familiar with this by now. A little bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat or the Q&A window. We'll address them during the Q&A and it'd be very much appreciated. We look forward to receiving those in due course. So over to the present. Today, we'll be learning a little more about the infamous radical who played such a significant role in the Peasants Revolt of 1381. Professor James Crossley's book, Spectre of John Ball, brings the past and present together and how this revolutionary continues to influence. We're thrilled to have Professor Crossley speak at this inaugural lecture commemorating the life of Paxton Chadwick. By the end of our time today, we hope you feel clearer and more confident in your understanding of this hugely important historical figure. But before I introduce James, I'd like to invite Steve Marsling to speak to you about Paxton Chadwick, the man who this lecture is named after. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Mark. It's not every day that we celebrate the life of somebody who has been elected as a communist councillor, not once, not twice, but over and over again. And it's even rarer to be speaking about a communist who's had a street in Leiston named after him, just a little way from where I'm sitting now, Paxton Chadwick Close. I must confess, I was living up in Manchester and making my living as an art dealer, and I came across these wonderful drawings in an auction, Cape's done, by a bloke called Paxton Chadwick, who I just looked at his drawings, which he did for Penguin Books, and thought they were really, really good. And I didn't have a clue about who Paxton Chadwick was, and certainly didn't know where Leiston was either at that time. So my first knowledge of Paxton Chadwick was as a fantastic artist, one that was associated with many, many books. But he was born in 1903 in Manchester. He went to Manchester Grammar School and then Manchester School of Art, and became a freelance designer. He left Manchester about 1931 to go and set up a studio in Chelsea. But by 1933, he had become an art teacher and secretary to A.S. Neil at the famous Summerhill School in Leiston, the first free school, I think, in the country. A.S. Neil wrote all about how education should be about enriching children's lives and not about caning them and flogging them. He was a very controversial figure. So Paxton joined the Summerhill School, and one of his colleagues, teaching colleagues, was A.L. Morton, who we're going to learn about from James, because the People's History of England has a large chapter on the Peasants Revolt and also on John Ball. A.L. Morton and Paxton Chadwick were close colleagues. At some point around 1935-36, Paxton Chadwick joined the Communist Party. He was involved in the welcoming of the hunger marches to Leiston, where thousands went in the Post Office Square, and he was also involved in aid to Spain, helping the fight for the democratically elected Republican government, who were under attack from the fascist forces of Franco, Mussolini, and Hitler, while our country did nothing he campaigned vigorously to find aid for Spain. He also became very active in local politics and was elected to the Urban District Council in 1935. At that time, shortly after that time, a few months, he founded the newspaper, or helped to found the newspaper, the Leiston Leader. This was a left-of-centre radical paper that sold for a halfpenny. Its first edition, I think, was January 1936. And Paxton did much of the cartoons and much of the illustrations that were there then. He was called up in 1941 to fight in the Second World War, and he joined the Royal Artillery and rose to the rank of Captain Paxton Chadwick. He was involved in the rebuilding of Germany, and he worked alongside the Soviet Red Army in the liberation forces, coming back to Leiston in around 1946. His wife, Lee Chadwick, became the first elected communist councillor in the East Suffolk County Council. We'd never had a communist councillor in Suffolk, but Lee Chadwick, Paxton's wife, became that. Paxton was re-elected to the Urban District Council, lost his place in 1950 narrowly, but was re-elected again in 1952 and carried on throughout as a communist councillor. And his record as a communist councillor was the reason why he was constantly re-elected. He was fantastically involved in housing, in all aspects of local government, constantly for the progressive causes that he did. It was a difficult time for Paxton. In 1956, as we know, Khrushchev revealed some of the revelations about the Stalinist era and the Hungarian uprising also. Paxton made the decision that this country and other countries needed a communist party. So while thousands did resign, Paxton didn't. Paxton stayed loyal to the Communist Party right up until his death in 1961. As I say, for the reason that he believed that a communist party, that a Marxist-Leninist party was needed to give guidance to the progressive movement of the labour movement. Sadly, he contracted cancer and died in 1961. John Gollum, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain, led the praise and eulogy at his funeral. He is an inspiration to Leiston. People realise, old people and young people know something of Paxton Chadwick. His example was an example to anyone who was elected a councillor to local authorities. So I commend Paxton Chadwick on this first one and look forward greatly to James Crossley's Spectres of John Ball, his lecture today. Over to you again, Mark.
Thank you very much, Steve. This part of East Anglia is certainly not short of socialist figures who have worked tirelessly for and on behalf of the working class. That was a very fitting tribute to his memory. Thank you for that. That was Steve Marsling. We now turn to our keynote speaker, Professor James Crossley. Welcome, James, to the Paxton Chadwick Commemorative Lecture 2022. We are very much looking forward to hearing your talk on the Spectres of John Ball. The floor is yours, James.
Right, I'm just going to share a PowerPoint. One second. I need the host to enable PowerPoint, if that's all right. Can you get that? Can the host enable screen sharing? Fortunately, this doesn't seem to be working. Right, now that works, right? So can you see that? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm genuinely pleased to be doing this in memory of Paxton Chadwick for many reasons. But one of them is, as I said to Mark and Steve before, is I'm starting to work on A.L. Morton. And so Paxton Chadwick is going to be an increasing part of my life in the next 18 months or so, I think. Also, what I'm going to talk about today is obviously John Ball. And John Ball was a figure who's, I think, become increasingly forgotten, particularly since the Second World War. But his peak fame, certainly in over the past couple of hundred years, is arguably around the time of the 1930s, around the time when A.L. Morton wrote the People's History of England. So much of what I'm going to say would have been quite familiar to Paxton Chadwick and part of the world in which he was involved with the Mortons, with the party, and so on. And I hope today can go some way to bringing figures like John Ball and the English radical tradition back to the fore again. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, 1381. And the Peasants Revolt. First of all, the title, which I'll come back to a little later on. The Peasants Revolt itself can be a little misleading. There were plenty of peasants involved. There were plenty of people who worked the land and so on. But it was a bit more than that. There were local officials. There were lower clergy. There were even some legal figures involved. And people who were looking to who had seen the potential for an increase in their material benefits and social status, looking for more. And when we go back to the causes of the Peasants' Revolt, we can see why a little bit. I mean, there are immediate causes, the French raids on the English coast not being protected and things like this. The most famous immediate cause being a poll tax of a series of poll taxes, but the poll tax of 1380, which looks like there was heavy-handed collection, including possibly, not quite sure how early this is, but this source is, but possibly including the assault of Wat Tyler's daughter, which led to Wat Tyler smashing the brains out of a tax collector. But the long-term causes, the longer-term causes are important here. And if we go back a bit to the mid 14th century and the Black Death, which had wiped out nearly a half of the population of Britain and Europe, this had led to a shortage of labor, and it meant that people who worked the land, peasants, could, and even people who were tied to the land, like serfs, could make more demands of the feudal lords. So if there's a shortage of labor, well, you can say, well, I want better conditions. I want to be able to move around more. I want to be able to work where I want. And the feudal lords, of course, resisted this. So what we've got in the 14th century is very much old-fashioned class conflict in the build-up to the Peasants' Revolt. And the Peasants' Revolt, in some ways, is an explosion of these tensions between the feudal lords and the lower orders. And John Ball looks very much like he was the voice of discontent, the ideologue of the uprising. And this is quite natural at the time. He was a priest. The ideological background to resistance and revolt and uprising would have been Christianity, the Bible, and things like this, in distinction from the Christianity and reading of the Bible of the feudal lords. So Ball's in a fairly long tradition, really, of resistance against feudal lords, but here we've got the case where there is a serious uprising. And the uprising takes place in the southeast of England, but really it's much broader than that. It's happening across the country, or many parts of the country. But the most famous part of the revolt, and that's become associated with John Ball and Wat Tyler and people like this, is in the southeast of England, in Kent and Essex, and then moves on to London. And one of the most remarkable features of this revolt is that the rebels managed to get into the Tower of London and kill some of the most important figures of the realm, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor, Simon Sudbury, for instance. It's a failed revolt, of course. Not in the summer of 1381. It's difficult to say how long it lasts, because it lasts for different periods in different parts of the country. But by the end of the summer, the rebels have been defeated. Wat Tyler's already been killed during the events in London. John Ball himself is captured in July and hung, drawn, quartered, and his body parts sent to 4 cities in England. But what it marks, I think, is the decline in the institution of serfdom, the idea that peasants are tied to the land, and John Ball becomes the voice of that. And it's rapidly in decline after the Peasants Revolt, and the Peasants Revolt marks a moment in that decline. So what do we know about John Ball? Well, not much, but actually surprisingly a fair bit. There's been some speculations on his upbringing, supposedly in Colchester, but as you can imagine, the name John Ball is pretty common, and lots of people called John Ball turn up in the historical record. But we do have some solid evidence about his early life. He seems to have spent most of his career in trouble with the authorities, with the church authorities, with secular authorities. He's imprisoned a couple of times. He's on the run a lot. He looks like he's got popular support. So there's one report in Latin of Ball who's able to evade the authorities like a fox is able to evade the hunter. And it's very likely he's got popular support so he can hide, and so on and so forth. He preaches not in the church itself, outside the churches, in the fields, in the courtyards, in the marketplace, or whatever, and he seems to have popular audience. We don't get too much insight into what he was preaching, but it does look very much like he's preaching against the wealth, privileges, and so on of the established church. He was probably he was almost certainly trained in York, and comes down to Colchester. And some people, this is where people start speculating where he might have originally been from. But that's really all we can say with any significant amount of certainty, that he was trained in York, comes down to Colchester, and is active around the southeast of England. So by the time of the revolt in 1381, he's the figure. He seems very popular, and he's the figure who articulates the discontent. Now, it seems that he starts off with the story of Adam and Eve, or the story of Adam and Eve just after they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And what do? Adam digs and Eve spins. He becomes associated with this famous saying. Others had said it before, but Ball becomes the person who most associated with it. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. The logic of this being the feudal lords have effectively created their own place in the social system. They weren't there in the beginning of time. This is a false imposition for them to have authority and power over the labouring classes. And they've been exploiting peasants. I mean, there's a few sayings attributed to Ball where he talks about what peasants have to do in the field. They have to work through these terrible conditions. They get the low quality food, whilst the lords live off their labour, eat well, sleep well, live in fancy castles, and so on. So how do you deal with this situation? Well, Ball was accused of heresy. He was accused of going against established church teaching. And it seems that Ball reverses this and accuses the aristocratic church of being heretics themselves and abandoning Christianity, abandoning the Bible, and so on. So he turns to the Bible to throw these allegations back at them. And reads the Bible and says, well, we need to kill them. we need to overthrow them. And looks very much like he encourages violence against the feudal lords and the feudal church. He's very clear, it seems, that he wants the end of serfdom, the idea that peasants have to be tied to the land and have to work for a given lord, and some very close to something like slavery. So he wants this to end. His teaching on his Christian teaching, his theological teaching, his teaching on the Bible is interesting because it focuses very much on labor and the labor involved in producing religious rituals and whatnot. So when he talks about the bread and the wine, or the bread particularly of the Eucharist, he focuses on the labor involved in making the bread. He talks about coded language of millers. He talks about grinding the bread, and this is and all this is taking place, it seems, at a time when there's a festival, Corpus Christi, about the Eucharist. And usually this is cast in high theological language about salvation for the sinner and all this kind of thing. But Ball seems to put the emphasis on salvation for the laboring classes, for the peasants. So it talks about their salvation, and their salvation is tied in with stories of the Exodus from Pharaoh in the Old Testament, the escape from slavery and things like this. He also emphasizes the importance of peasants having access to political decision-making. It's not quite egalitarian in the sense that we might be familiar with labels like egalitarian. There's still a hierarchy in place. There's still a peasant hierarchy in place, I think, with John Ball. And he seems that his followers want him to be the sole religious figure in England, the sole bishop in England, and it seems that he's quite happy to take that role himself. But this also means that the priests have got to start behaving themselves. It looks very much like he calls them bastards, quite in the sense that they're illegitimate and they're from the line of bastards in the biblical tradition who are responsible for sin and exploitation and things like this. Priests now have to be not exploit the poorer people. They have to be paid according to what they do, rather than just exploit their position for developing lands and things like this. It also seems like he has the idea of an ideal king. I mean, this is again a peasant context. We've not got to the English Revolution yet, where you clearly get the idea of overthrowing a king and killing a king. Here, it seems like there is still a sort of naive peasant view that the king will be on their side. The king is young. The king will, if the king could just see how they're being exploited, the king will act. Of course, the very opposite happens. But this is a very much a common peasant reading of a golden age, when with an ideal king and everyone in the place, and there will be justice. And once you get this grand transformation, there is the hope that all things will be in common. And this seems to be a feature of John Ball's preaching. It seems to be a feature of what the peasants want. And it's not quite clear what is meant by all things in common, but I think there are indications in some of the sources that that it involves access to the land. And here's just one quotation from a chronicle at the time. And it's from a discussion between Wat Tyler and the king. All game, whether in waters or in parks and in woods, should become common to all, so that everywhere in the realm, in rivers and fish ponds and woods and forests, they may take the wild beasts and hunt the hare in the fields and do many other such things without restraint. So, unfortunately, Ball is unsuccessful. The rebels are unsuccessful. The violent putting down of the revolt follows. And what also follows is effectively 400 years of bad publicity. I mean, you've seen what Corbyn got in the media over a couple of years. This is 400 years of that and then some. He's immediately presented as the archetypal heretic. This is any heresy you want to put down, you will say, well, that's just like John Ball. So the people like Wycliffe and the Lollards who were active around this time, they get associated with Ball. Ball gets associated with them, and it's designed to discredit both. Whether Ball was actually a Lollard or not, I mean, it's been argued. I'm not so sure. But the point is, for now, that it's to discredit Ball and any other heretical movements. Or the very common allegation is that he's demonic. Now, this looks, sometimes I think this is probably understood to be quite literal. I mean, there were later reports of the revolt saying we saw a demon among their midst. Ball gets associated with being like possessed by demons, and he is the teacher of evil and things like this. And it's not just, this doesn't just have sort of religious connotations. These have got very strong political connotations. Ball is seen as the seditious threat to the nation. He's used as an example of if there's a threat to the nation, you're like John Ball. Anyone who's wants to be discredited as being a threat to the king and to the stability of the realm, John Ball. So that's all set in place really by the time we get to the 16th century. And in the 16th century, when it's the English Reformation, when it's the split from the Catholic Church, Ball again gets there's a new twist on the story. When this Church of England wants to, or the emerging Church of England, I should say, wants to cast the Reformation gone too far, too extreme in its Protestantism, John Ball becomes the go-to figure. You're a bit like what's going on in the continent. It'll all be debauch. There'll be sex on the streets. There'll be drinking. There'll be this, that, and the other, and there'll be a threat to the king, or the queen in the case of Elizabethan England. There is, interestingly, possibly a hint that there is an ongoing tradition that Ball is a hero. Now, a couple of Protestants seem to like him, not because he was a threat to the realm, not because of any kind of teachings against the social hierarchy, but because they think he was actually killed by the Catholic Church for being a Protestant. But this is very dangerous, and you can see in subsequent editions of certain people's work that this just gets airbrushed out and gets erased, because they know if they start saying John Ball's a good guy, they might get killed for it. On the stage, you get this with Shakespeare as well. Shakespeare in Henry VI Part 2 has Jack Cade, another English rebel, but actually it's all based on John Ball. And at roughly the same time, there's an anonymous play called The Life and Death of Jack Straw, and they both do potentially similar things in, well, especially The Life and Death of Jack Straw. It doesn't have a wholly negative view of John Ball. It's not positive. It'd never get it past the censors if it was positive. But it doesn't explicitly put judgment on the figure of John Ball when they're retelling the Peasants Revolt. And some people have argued, and I'm not sure how far to push this, but that he's seen as a kind of sympathetic figure, and that people in the audience who come from a lower order background may just laugh along and think, yeah, I know people like him, and I kind of have no problem with it. And here's just one quotation that he's a sort of jokey but sympathetic figure. So he just says, what is he, an honest man? The devil he is. He's a parson of the town. You think there's no knavery hid under his black gown. Find him in a pulpit but twice in a year, and I'll find him 40 times in the alehouse tasting strong beer. Now, that might, you get that to the censors of the players. They might think, well, okay, this is a great, fine, good judgment on the man. He's a terrible human being. Put that to a more rural audience or a lower order audience on the stage. You think, yeah, I know people like that. I'd rather my priest be like that than someone checking up on me all the time. Anyway, I'll just throw that out there. Nevertheless, the overwhelming reception, understanding of John Ball is that he's a wrong 'un. And by the time we get to the English Revolution, he doesn't get reclaimed by the revolutionaries, or not. He doesn't get reclaimed. There's a possibility that they are quite sympathetic, but just don't use him in that sense. But certainly on the royalist side, he's treated as this. The revolutionaries are like John Ball come again. And there's a story attributed to John Cleveland called the Idol of the Clowns, or the Insurrection of Wat Tyler, and it relentlessly has a go at this devilish figure John Ball, as I'm going to quote here, and this just goes on and on and on. It's calling him one Baal, the most sottish and most unworthy, but most factious of the clergy, is stirred up by the devil who, if rebellion be the sin of witchcraft, is the father of both, be the Antichrist of this reign. To blaspheme and cry down God and Caesar is anointed, and the rights in God and Caesar of these imaginations was the foolish priest in the county of Kent called John Wall. He's sometimes called John Wall rather than Ball. And to make it plain that he was the father of the uproar. And then it just continues with a long screed against John Ball. So he becomes really, this is probably the lowest point for Ball, in the sense that he's really everything bad that's gone wrong with England from a royalist perspective. After the English Revolution, with the restoration of the monarchy, Ball again gets a different lease of life. He becomes a warning against absolute monarchy, because if you want a monarch completely in control, you might end up like John Ball. He gets also tied with Parliament. If Parliament gets too much strength, you might end up like John Ball. He gets associated with foreign threats to security and tied in with the idea of a national constitution. If we go too far, you end up like John Ball. Now becomes a Catholic threat as well, probably an important moment, in that now he's seen as a Catholic, and he's saying, well, Catholics are a threat to the crown, be like John Ball. Also starts getting a slightly bit jokier as well in the 18th century. He gets tied in with the gin craze. He gets put on stage as a wild, crazy, drunken preacher. But and the subtext of some of this looks like it's polemics from London, warning about the countryside. You know what these rural types are like. They'll come and destroy our property, come in and destroy London if we don't watch them. So the story of John Ball becomes a story of, just like London protected the city from the peasants in 1381. It's not true, but that's what the story, this is how they frame it. So we should protect London against threats from the countryside, foreign threats, or just wild country folk. But in the 18th century, we start getting a transformation in his reputation. And this is going alongside the transformation from feudalism to capitalism. And towards the end of the 18th century, we even get some sympathies from unlikely sources. David Hume, the philosopher and historian of England, writes a history of England. He was coming from something like something like an establishment perspective. But when he sees things like when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, he thinks it's not that bad, is it? It seems quite reasonable. But they shouldn't have used violence to do what they wanted, and so still condemns Ball and the rebels. And feudalism now and serfdom is so far behind, it's difficult to argue against someone who complains about serfdom. So there's people like David Hume and others just saying, well, yeah, they had a point, but they shouldn't have used violence. But the French and American revolutions really changed things. There's a famous debate between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke over revolution versus conservatism, but also this becomes a debate over Wat Tyler and John Ball, whether they're good guys or not. And Paine is very pro Wat Tyler and says he should have a memorial and things like this. Burke says he really goes for John Ball, but but the fact that Edmund Burke has a right go at John Ball probably, in fact, almost certainly means in radical circles, John Ball is seen as a good guy. Then if Burke hates him, he can't be all bad. And this is exactly what happens in England in the 1790s. There's a clear reclaiming of John Ball as a great English hero. And it comes from different sections of society, but including from artisans and what would become working class England. So John Baxter, silversmith, writes a history of England and start saying Ball is a terrific figure. He's one of the great English heroes. He was fighting for lost English rights. And it's the people who opposed him who are the people who are opposing us now in the 1790s. Probably the most influential, certainly the most influential understanding of John Ball comes from Robert Southey in a poem play called Wat Tyler, but it's really all about John Ball. And it talks, and it really, it's thinking about the idea of what you do with revolutionary violence, how you need to be disciplined. It's not just violence for violence sake. And Ball is a kind of saintly figure here who doesn't like excessive violence, but wants the transformation of the country. And Robert Southey writes this in 1794. But the particularly interesting thing about it is that it's not published. So how could it be influential if it wasn't published? Well, but in the turn of the 19th century, Robert Southey is becoming increasingly establishment figure and becomes poet laureate, and he starts sending people off to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, who he would have been sympathetic towards, who would have been his comrades in his earlier life, and so he becomes the sort of arch apostate. He got a 180-degree conversion from his earlier radicalism. Unfortunately for him, somehow some of his opponents, some journalists, find his youthful play poem, Wat Tyler, and pirate it and publicize it everywhere. And it becomes the standard understanding of John Ball for, I'd say, at least 50, 60 years into the 19th century. Designed to humiliate him, but suddenly it's got a huge popular audience, particularly among emerging working classes. Cheap, easy, be performed, no problem. And by the time we get really into the 19th century, John Ball is now, by and large, with some exceptions, a hero, and a hero of the emerging working classes. And he's tied in with what we can call something like a constitutionalism from below. And this is a driving myth of much of the 19th century, that in Anglo-Saxon times, the English, and it is English, were free. They had rights. There was they had input into into decision making and so on and so forth, until the Normans came under William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, as he's relentlessly called, and imposed feudalism. And that has continued to the present into the capitalist domination. These are the heirs of the Norman feudalists. And so John Ball becomes seen as someone who fought for restoring lost Anglo-Saxon rights. And this comes into debates over the extent to political representation in the 19th century. So the middle classes are now getting representation in Parliament, reform of Parliament and all this. But then where do the working classes fit in? Middle classes use them to get the vote, but then there is a very strong idea that the working classes were betrayed because they were not given full voting rights. And there's novels. There's a great novel. It's not great in the sense ideologically great, but it's still worth reading. It's Mrs. O'Neill, whoever Mrs. O'Neill may be, wrote a novel called The Bondman about the Peasants Revolt. And this is a sort of sympathetic reading of the Peasants Revolt, but it makes out we don't want these rowdy working classes to be too violent. It's a commentary on the present as well. These tough, rough-looking working class types, they went too far in 1381. It was their desire for violence that they couldn't control led to the disaster in 1381. So please, can you behave yourselves in the present? And we'll do our best for you to get political representation as we go along. This had limited effect in terms of his propagandist use. And by the time we get to Chartism, the rise of Chartism at the end of that decade, they are going full on for middle-class betrayal. And John Ball and Wat Tyler and co. become a very useful story for them because there's a threat of violence. I mean, there's this split in Chartism between how far do we use the threat of violence, or do we do it peacefully and so on. But the threat of violence with John Ball and Wat Tyler and so on become a very important part of Chartism in attacking middle-class betrayal and the hope for workers' rights, for political rights and so on. But another angle to this, I think, that takes off and is worth stressing is that is this idea of English identity. This is like a restoring an England, but it's an England that's not grounded in race, ethnicity, and so on. I mean, I don't want to overly romanticize this, but it's pretty clear that this idea that of a lost Anglo-Saxon rights means for Chartists that you can include Irish, even Jewish. I mean, there's some dubious statements here and there about Jews, but there's not a racial dimension to it in the strong sense. And also, we get William Cuffey rising to the ranks of Chartism, and he's treated as like the ultimate Englishman. He comes from a slave background, gets brought to the shores of England, and he's working class, trade unionist, musician, wonderful command of the English language and English history, and gets treated as the ultimate Englishman because he does these things. At the same time, in Victorian England, people like Cuffey's getting racist and racialized treatment from the establishment press and from satirists, are creating an England that's grounded in ethnicity, race, and things like this. There's a significant alternative to this, grounded oddly in Anglo-Saxon England, and this is also the idea that Irish Chartists could get involved because it was seen as a time when England was not doing what it's done in Ireland. As one commentator put it, Alfred the Great didn't have blood on his hands in Ireland. Now, it's obviously a convenient myth and all this kind of thing, but an interesting one nonetheless. And this starts a long tradition of John Ball being a kind of almost like an anti-racist campaigner, an anti-slavery campaigner, because he would have opposed slavery in America just like he opposed serfdom. And we've got one man, James Redpath, who goes out to America and uses the name John Ball or John Ball Jr. and writes letters in the name of John Ball Jr. when he goes and meets slaves, and he tries to encourage slave revolution, I think would be an apt term here, in the American South. And it seems as if he can use the idea of John Ball because he's not tied in so strongly with British imperialism or white America, but English ideas of this idea of an England that's inclusive of people irrespective of their background, whether Irish, black, or whatever. And that continues well into the 20th century and probably up to the present, I think. Well, aside here, that when we get into the later 19th century, we start getting the label Peasants Revolt. And I think it's worth just noting this because it's quite interesting. I've given a few examples here from probably the first example from New Monthly magazine of the term Peasants Revolt. The most influential use was John Richard Green in his very popular short history of the English people. It's a sort of liberals, vaguely socialist reading of English history. Very, very popular and very influential on the later emerging labour movement. And we can see there's plenty of other examples from around this time. And I think the reason why this label takes off is because we're starting to get the development of National Agricultural Labourers Union in 1872. The dates you'll see very striking. A year later, this is being called a Peasants' Revolt. So he's getting tied in with rural workers quite explicitly in the second half of the 19th century. And this has a long legacy too. Into the 20th century, the most famous one is probably the Socialist church at Facstead, where they play up very strongly on the idea of rural workers, particularly Jack Putterell, who was involved with the National Union of Agricultural Workers, and really going for the kind of rural folkish element to the Peasants' Revolt. And that's been quite influential in its history of understanding and interpretation. But perhaps the most influential figure at the end of the 19th century was William Morris, and his reading and understanding of John Ball dominates for the next, I don't know, 50 odd years. Morris wrote The Dream of John Ball, first serialized in Commonwealth in 1886 to 1887. And it's a kind of dream vision where the man from Essex, which is effectively Morris himself, goes back to the revolt, talks with John Ball, and, well, gives him the bad news that it's going to fail. Not only are you going to fail, it's going to take not just another couple of years, not just 100 years, but many centuries for his dream to come about. And this is effectively what Morris does, is popularize a historical materialist reading of John Ball and English history. The idea that how do we understand the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, and then from capitalism to socialism and communism. So he has extended discussions with John Ball about what the future will be and how things will change, and how they have to go through a capitalist era before we can realize John Ball's dream of a world where things are shared in common, and so on. And this is incredibly popular certainly on the left and in the Labour movement. One bit that isn't quite as popular, well, it isn't, is the idea that Morris wants to rescue something of the Catholicism and medievalism of John Ball. Not that we should all go back to medieval England, but he sees this is a time when, for all the problems, this was a time when the worker was closely in connection with what they produce, and could put love into what they produced, and they weren't alienated in the way that the worker is under capitalism. So it's taking out the best bits of medievalism, best bits of Catholicism, and using them for what a future socialist world would look like. I mean, Morris isn't a believer or anything. He's part of this idea popular amongst late 19th and early 20th socialists of taking the best bits, what they see as the best bits of religion, and transforming them into a socialist vision. Oh yeah, I've just put this in as an aside. People start talking about what he looks like at this point, and I haven't got a good answer to this, but for some reason he's got a big nose. William Morris says this. Everyone comments on the size of John Ball's nose for some reason. I haven't got a good explanation, but the best I can come up with is there was this update in here on the far right of a medieval painting in very much a Victorian style, and I think they've just closed in on it when everyone's got stylized kind of big noses, and they've given John Ball one here, and everyone just copies that. And Morris certainly had a copy of this, incidentally, and I think it might be as simple as that. But sometimes he's presented as very thin, emaciated, because he's been in prison, and this can be seen as a sign of resilience and things. But he's sometimes seen as quite a big figure. And I think, again, you don't want to read too much into this. I think there's part of it is he's paralleled with figures like Friar Tuck. A lot of this stuff is tied in with Robin Hood stories. But this is a little bit later, this first one on the left. And this is from the Daily Worker. Substantial looking Ball, but also quite hard. He really could cause some damage to you. And I think there might be, again, I'm just speculating a little bit, but this is, if you want a Ball for class war, you want it to be a threat, not some proto-hippie or something like that. So anyway, there's a little bit of speculation for him. And into the post-Morris, I mean, when we get into the 20th century, we're almost always dealing with Morris's understanding of Ball. But nonetheless, he's now seen in different ways. He could be seen as a parliamentary reformer, a socialist, a communist, usually a Protestant, incidentally. Morris's Catholic vision doesn't really take off. He's picked up in, quite interestingly, in suffragism. That's not a massive surprise as it might seem, because we're dealing at a time when there's not the canon of female heroes and feminist heroes that would develop into the 20th century. So early on, who else is going to support women's rights and rights for votes and things like this? Well, John Ball, and he's picked up in the suffragist press and various figures. Women offer the first significant and sustained interpretation of John Ball in the late 19th century and turn of the 20th century through novels. And this is because particularly more elite women have the space and time to write novels. And so we get a few in the tradition of John Ball, where he remains, interestingly, socialist, liberal, sometimes communist. And around this time, he effectively becomes the founding figure of homegrown English socialism. But there's usually, with a couple of exceptions, seen as in an internationalist context. So just as England has its radical traditions, so do Scotland, Ireland, sometimes Britain, if it's you can put England, Scotland, Wales together. But also like in America, Europe, or wherever. And it's paralleled with resistance to slavery and things like this. And this makes him quite a convenient figure to be taken up in the fight against fascism and in the Popular Front ideas of the 1930s. And really, this is his, I would say, from Morris to this period is his peak. And this is the idea that which the party pushed as well very strongly, that we need to look at national traditions, homegrown traditions against fascism, and so fascists can't appropriate them. And as far as I know, fascists didn't try to appropriate John Ball, not in any significant way. I mean, it's very difficult for them to do so. But John Ball becomes this sort of this key figure in English radicalism. I mentioned earlier, I mean, there's several examples I can give here, and there's A.L. Morton's People's History of England, which of course on its front page has a quotation from A Dream of John Ball. And as was said at the beginning, this was something that interests Morton and would have been a part of all that world, Paxton Chadwick world, all that they would have known these kinds of stories. This was also, well, there were popular pageants as well, including a very significant one, at least there's a couple, several actually, run by the Communist Party, and there was one in Hyde Park. Seems to have been thousands present. Paul Robeson was there, one of them anyway. And it starts with Ball. It goes through the history of feudalism, resistance to Victorian capitalism, and now we need resistance to fascism. And we've got, and it ends, it's almost like a history of martyrs, beginning with people like John Ball and ending with people who've been killed and party members in the Spanish Civil War. After World War II, his reputation goes into decline, and you can actually sort of measure this a little bit. The newspapers before World War II, there's loads of references. After World War II, just dips sharply. But he's not without his advocates. Alan and Nancy Bush write the opera, Wat Tyler. But quite interestingly, this doesn't get put on in England, despite the reputation of Alan Bush, and it's in East Germany where it gets put on first, and it presents a story of what the family could be like in post-fascist Germany, and it doesn't get put on really in England on the stage until the 1970s. So it's starting to become a bit of a problem again. The Communist Party Historians Group recognized the importance of John Ball and the Peasants' Revolt, and Rodney Hilton in particular takes this up and writes a number of important works on the Peasants' Revolt and John Ball in the post-war 20th century. And it gives probably the strongest articulation of a historical materialist reading, how John Ball and how the Peasants' Revolt fits into the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, how the Peasants' Revolt was a part of the more economically developed Southeast, how this in the long run develops into agrarian capitalism, and in the further long run still develops into capitalism as we come to know it. But we also get in the Cold War the idea that Ball was a fanatic, and people like Ball and other such figures in medieval Europe were the precursors of both fascism and communism. And something I know we've similar meetings to this, we've talked about this before, how the fascism and communists get linked together as if they're the same kind of thing. And there's people like Norman Cohn who do this quite explicitly in some quite influential works, that Ball and others are the sort of proto-communist stroke fascists somehow. There's another resurgence in 1981, the 600th anniversary. Some people here may have even been involved in some of these events. There's a lot going on here, but in some ways, 1981 marks a significant change. I put two pamphlets here, one by A.L. Morton and one by Paul Foote, and they represent two different ways the Peasants' Revolt were being understood on the left. And one is Morton is sort of the last hurrah, not the last hurrah, I hope, but a fading historical materialist tradition at the time of reading John Ball and the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, whereas Paul Foote and others were pushing for this idea that peasants were actually far more closely related to us today, and wanted to reject what he called, and I think quite wrongly, but doesn't matter for now, the idea that certain historical materialist readings were trying to claim that peasants were too different to us. But people like Paul Foote, I think, collapsed the difference between us today and the peasants then, that it becomes quite a problem for understanding what you do with a violent figure like John Ball. Someone like Morton, someone like Rodney Hilton could explain the violence of the Peasants' Revolt in its medieval context. I think this became a massive problem once we got rid of their historical materialist understanding, because John Ball now becomes a sort of vaguely, possibly Protestant, but no one really cares about the religious side of him, just like most of the UK today, or most of England, certainly. And I think it's striking that the most popular rendition of John Ball comes through a folk song by Sidney Carter, who wrote some of the hymns I had to sing and mimed at school. And but he wrote Sing John Ball, and gone at the idea that John Ball could be this violent revolutionary type of figure. And now it's a preacher of love and hope for light coming in the morning. And this is part of Ball is increasingly becoming something like a nice social democrat towards the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. I think the idea of the Ball of an anti-racist figure is common in this. We reclaim an English tradition against the likes of the BNP and the EDL and so on. But it's also Ball would have been supported the NHS. He would have supported a welfare state, but would have supported parliamentary democracy. And you can see, interestingly, some folk singers, when they cover this song, when they give you a little write-up on John Ball, that you can sort of see the shock in the very writing when they find out that he was into decapitating archbishops and things like this. How do you tie that in with the idea of a nice sort of liberal left social democratic John Ball? There's an interesting piece by Owen Jones on the English radical tradition, and he really struggles. He can't cope with the idea of John Ball being violent or the English Revolution being violent. So you get phrases such as the English revolutionists of the 17th century, something, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like, had problems with the king or something like this. They chopped his head off. But this becomes, once you get rid of that historical materialist reading, it becomes very hard to explain why these were extremely violent movements. However, the idea of a violent, different, religious John Ball does thrive. Interestingly, it thrives in on the far left in some parts, especially with the further removed from the Guardian and parliamentary democracy you are, the more likely you are to see these understandings of Ball, but also in fiction and popular TV, popular documentaries. The last thing you want, I mean, if you did a documentary where they all had a sit-down protest or something, it would be boring. If you're going to watch if you want a documentary on the Peasants' Revolt, you want the full blood and gore, and they give you that. And that's because I think in neoliberal capitalism, the radicalism can be performed for you on TV, in popular histories and so on. But on the other hand, they are actually providing a resource for trying to understand and explain why we have violent upheavals in English radical history. So that's where we are at the moment. I think I'll finish there, if that's all right, and take questions.
Thank you very much, James. Wonderful stuff. Well, there's so much there in that short time with us, and a huge amount left within the pages of your book, which I got a relatively early copy of, and well, I've not yet managed to get to the end. Every page is full of reference, full of insight, and hugely educational piece. I have to congratulate you on this. I think it will be the go-to book if ever you want anything to know anything about John Ball and the times at which he lived and those since. Of course, this is the book to go to, and it begs the question, really. I often wonder, James, in your heavy research of this book, because I think just about every page has a footnote with reference point on it, or points. I often wonder that whenever you're researching your subject, also you're busy writing notes, annotations, etc. Have you ever been minded to leave any of those sort of notelets within the pages of the books that you're using to research a particular subject for the next reader, perhaps?
Am I doing that?
Have you ever been minded to do that? Just as
to mean physically leave them, you mean?
Yeah.
No, of course not. That'd be sacrilege. Also, I've got very distinctive, terrible handwriting. So if anyone did know me, they might know who did it.
Right. But we're going to take a few questions that have been put up in the chat on our Zoom, and I'm not going to take them in any particular order. But many thanks from the people that are on our Zoom session here, and those across Twitter and Facebook as well, which we're streaming along. Are very grateful for your speech today, your lecture. One of the questions was, what part did women play in the People's Rising during John Ball's time, the Peasants Revolt, and what was his take on their influence or not, as the case may be?
Okay, it's an very interesting question. There's been a lot of work done on very recently done on finding out the demographics about the people who are involved in the revolt. Lower clergy turn up quite a lot, interestingly, but women don't, and that's not a massive surprise given the times. I think some people were quite hopeful that we'd get more women involved, but they are certainly there. But what we do get is that we get women involved in some of the legal stuff. So there were women involved, and we get some quite striking examples of individual women involved. There was a woman who was just described as a wicked woman, obviously because the sources were very hostile to the Peasants' Revolt at the time, who was involved in the execution of the Archbishop of Canterbury and others. So she's certainly around guarding or keeping a lookout on around the Tower of London. There's probably the most famous woman involved was Joanna Ferrer, who seems to have had quite an active part in the revolt. In Cambridge, there's Marjorie Starr, who is there rejoicing happily when they're burning all the official records in Cambridge, and so we get her. So we do get individual women named, and I think uprisings like this give the opportunity for a shift, even temporary, slight, or whatever, in gender relations and so on. So it's certainly clear that women did. Whether John Ball had a view on it, that we don't, not directly. I mean, he may well have done, of course, but his saying is, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. I mean, it's men and women labouring in that talk, and he does talk about Eve elsewhere as well. So women are certainly included in that sense. And William Morris ran with this a little bit about recognizing women's work and so on in certainly in a socialist world to come, that this should be treated equally and respectfully and so on. So there's something of an answer, I hope, for that question.
Thank you. Thanks for that, James. I'm going to come to a question that was put in our Q&A box. The question is, has a connection to the English radical tradition been missing on the left for some time? The contributor there says, for me, it certainly has, and leaves a flank open to the far right in the working class. I think it's a particularly poignant question, given some of the activities and reporting of trades union leaders and what they're saying today and what they have historically said in the past in their struggle fighting fascism in their working class communities. So great question there.
Yeah, the answer is yes and a bit no. I think in one sense you certainly can find it on the left. If you look at the Morning Star's been pretty good, and others, so you can find it on the left certainly, but it's not like it was on the left say 100 years ago, when we'd have all known this and all sorts of other traditions. It had been common for not just people who have been in the party, but people on the left generally. People well, let me give you one example. Is Dream of John Ball by William Morris was found in the houses, regularly found in the houses of miners in Cumberland, used, tattered, well-read copies of it. So this was popular. Now that would not be the case today, clearly. There's been attempts to bring it back. I mean, there was talk about bringing it back with the whole Corbyn thing. I think that's all good and things, but it's almost out of nowhere now, and the left has been left behind on these questions of an English tradition, because I think it's been sometimes legitimately, sometimes wrongly, the idea that there's questions about patriotism and all this kind of thing, and sometimes you can see exactly why this is a problem, but other times you can see that there was a tradition in this country, and there still is a little bit of one, where talking about an English radical tradition or a British radical tradition isn't tied in with the idea that you have to be white or whatever, or ethnically British or ethnically English, whatever the hell that means. But it's tied in with identity, working class identity. It's tied in with political ideas and so on and so forth. You can be part of this story. It doesn't matter where you were born. We want to transform England. We want to transform the context around us. That has been the loss of that has been a problem, I think, and I think the question is right. It's the far right and the right even have just taken it up and dominated. I mean, I think Brexit was one of the obvious examples of how the right won that. I mean, the Labour had an opportunity, the left-wing understanding of Brexit had an opportunity to bring this up, but I think the problem is it's been so discredited by sort of liberal left attempt to overthrow this that they won't touch the idea of an English radical tradition in some circles. So I think we need to recover that, and there was some of it with on the sort of left reading of Brexit, but I think this is quite an urgent thing if you want to connect with working class communities and things, because the left is just not trusted on issues of England, Britain, and so on.
Thank you for that, James. I guess in a sense, this next question I have follows a little bit from the previous, in the sense that we're talking about traditions, radical traditions, English radical traditions, and that comes very much through education that's passed on from generation to generation. And this next question, the contributor states, I did not learn of John Ball at school in the 50s and 60s, just the Peasants Revolt. Are today's pupils taught about him and his life?
A little bit. The Peasants Revolt is on the is taught in schools, and you'll do a little bit about John Ball. So it's certainly there. Quite how much it sticks, I don't know. But there's something for people to hold on to. But I mean, I mean, the problem is you'll do it for a couple of weeks or whatever, and that'll be it. Won't touch it again. So it's good that it's in schools, but there needs to be more of it, a lot more of it. Well, I'd like it to be a lot more of it. I suspect there won't be. But that's why stuff outside schools is also important as well.
We've got a comment here. Absolutely brilliant, James. The Leiston leader, which was mentioned by Steve in his introduction for this lecture, Paxton Chadwick Commemorative Lecture, inaugural lecture. The Leiston leader that was mentioned was still being published in the 70s and 80s by the local Labour by the local Leiston Communist Party branch. 2 of its members were elected to the council during this period. Also mentions the dagger that was used to kill Wat Tyler is on display at, as we know, as Fishmongers Hall in London. Yeah, very much enjoyed, contributor, very much enjoyed that. And just to follow on in the sense of the Leiston leader, adjacent to Leiston is, of course, Sizewell and the nuclear power station. And there's a question here: how would Paxton Chadwick or even John Ball respond to Sizewell C, I wonder? Apparently this question here comes from a person who has met Paxton's widow, Lee, back in the 70s, a very strong woman. Great talk, by the way, very educative, and thank you. So yeah, put yourself in the shoes of Paxton Chadwick and John Ball if you can. I mean, they're mighty shoes to fill, John.
James, this is the hardest question of them all, I think. I will defer to someone who knew Paxton Chadwick's views on these matters more than me, so I won't dare to claim what would John Ball thought. Well, depends what his view on nuclear energy would have been. He would have. Well, I guess if it went, if there was, I don't know. What the answer would have to be, would it be in the interests of, for us, it would be called working class. Let's just call it lower order, so it covers then and now. What would be the best deal for the lower orders to have, to be able to share things in common and live without being exploited economically and so on. Now, if you think Sizewell C does that, then yes. If you don't, then no. That's too difficult. I don't normally say no to questions. I always try to give some answer, but I can't. It's beyond my abilities, I'm afraid. Sorry, Alan.
One which you may well, I guess you will be able to answer is whether or not Marx or Engels, Lenin, and so forth, maybe Stalin, had mentioned much, written much, discussed much in their letters about Tyler and John Ball and the Peasants' Revolt.
Engels did when he was talking about the peasant war in Germany, and it's quite a complicated passage actually, but he looks at he's trying to understand what kind of these apocalyptic and millenarian and egalitarian and wild movements of medieval Europe, how they fed into longer term changes. And there's some kind of interesting stuff there on how these ideas stand outside the order at the time and then get transformed and taken up into bourgeois thought later on. I mean, that's quite an influential reading in the Marxist understanding of these apocalyptic type figures, is how and you certainly get this with people like Rodney Hilton later, is how these calls for egalitarianism and so on get secularized and transformed into bourgeois thought, and really also but split with the emergence of capitalism. They go in the one direction of bourgeois rhetoric about freedom and so on, but also go into socialist and working class rhetoric as well. So Engels does. There is a pamphlet in Russia, in the Soviet Union, I forget the exact date, but it's early 1920s, on What Tile, and it's got a picture of John Ball on there as well. Fortunately, I can't read Russian, which is annoying, but I understand it's getting translated. Someone's got some money to translate it. So there is something from early Soviet Union as well, which I'm looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, that does sound very interesting. Obviously, this webinar is part of East of England District, a Communist Party put together by the party here in the East of England. East of England has and played a significant part. East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, being particularly rural and agricultural, had a huge amount of agitation, events going on and revolutionary events going on. And there's a question here asking, does John Ball have any links to Bury St Edmunds and the destruction at the Abbey, St Edmund?
No and yes. I don't think, not in the in 1381 and this, but he does turn in accounts, in rereadings of the Peasants Revolt in the, I don't know how early this is off the top of my head, but it's certainly in the 18th century. He starts getting tied in with the uprisings as the one of the chief agitators in East Anglia. Quite why this starts to happen, I'm not sure, but I think it's something to do with him being a priest and connected with John Raw and people like that. So, but he certainly does turn up in later understandings, but I don't think you can make the case that he was involved in the 14th century. In fact, I mean, the sheer logistics of it getting there and all that is one problem, but he's very much tied in with Kent, Essex, and London at the time of the revolt in the earliest accounts. And there's even to throw a spanner in the works, there's really good medieval historian found a record to a man released from prison called John Ball, a traitor, in Bishop Stortford, which, if that's true, then that makes things even more complicated still. Well, if it's true, but if it's the John Ball, it makes things even more complicated. But so I think there's a no and yes is my answer to that.
And I'm going to take this as one of the final questions, James. And this is one about the possible cross-pollination between Ball and English radicalism and its Irish counterpart, and its use as a tool against the anti-Irish sentiment in particular, and more broader, racism in general. I was wondering if you could just spend a little bit of time on that. That's quite a big question.
It is, but it's an interesting one. Is there any cross-pollination between Ball and it? There's a long history of this, and the establishment reading of John Ball has when something happens in Ireland, when there's discontent in Ireland, they said, oh, it's like John Ball, it's like Wat Tyler, like the Peasants Revolt again, and they try to discredit it that way. The interesting thing is people you get Irish dissidents saying yes, we are like John Ball and Wat Tyler, and so on. And so there certainly is, and there certainly are connections. This is part of the reason why this Anglo-Saxon thing oddly was important for Irish Chartists, and there's something similar going on in Irish radicalism as well, about looking to an idealized past and so on. James Connolly talks about John Ball There are other Irish socialists, more radical figures embrace John Ball, because I think he's a figure who might be English, but he's against the English or the British state as it would have been understood in the 19th and 20th century. Bobby Sands talks about Wat Tyler. So there's quite a few examples of Irish uses of John Ball, Wat Tyler, and so on, Peasants Revolt, and positive uses. And I think there's some scope for more study on this as well, because there's clearly comparative traditions in Ireland, and the fact that these seem to cohere pretty well would I mean, I focused on England, but I kept coming across, without trying, Irish examples of uses of John Ball, and in very similar ways as well to the more radical end of the English tradition. And I think it's partly rooted in some of this it's partly rooted in the fact that these uses allegations against the Irish who took it up, and partly in the connections between Irish working class movements and English working class movements as well. So you can give you a story, a myth that's shared without excluding one or the other.
Thank you, James. Well, I think we can all agree that was absolutely fantastic, hugely informative and very enjoyable talk, James. Thank you to everybody who has joined us today, joined us and also made contributions to making this inaugural Paxton Chadwick Commemorative Lecture such a success. Your questions have been absolutely fantastic. I think you'll agree with that, James. I'm really grateful to everyone. The future for you, James, obviously you're still very much living the John Ball, the spectres of John Ball, and it's a work that's obviously taken many months, years to put together. How difficult is it for you to move on to the next challenge, onto your next challenge? And if you do have another challenge, perhaps you could share that with us.
It could be. It's not straightforward moving on, because I mean it's my favorite topic I've ever worked on, and I did go into in more detail than I've probably gone into anything else before. But one thing did grow out of it, and it's taken me a while to find my feet on it, but I think I have now, and that's A.L. Morton, who was mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned as well, and of course, friend of Paxton Chadwick. So I'm working on A.L. Morton at the moment, doing quite a bit on his life, which is looking like it's turned into some kind of biography of him now, and so, well, of obvious relevance for East of England. So that's what it is. So I'll hopefully have more on A.L. Morton in the months and years to come. Wonderful.
Well, again, leaves me to say thank you to everyone for joining us at this Paxton Chadwick Commemorative Lecture. Just as the gentleman Paxton Chadwick was, we're equally passionate about working class education, and I'm sure we will have many more exciting stories and learnings to share through these lectures over the months and years to come. Thank you again to Professor James Crossley, to Steve Marsling, and to everyone who's joined us here. I'll leave you to it. Thank you, and please pick up a copy of The Spectres of John Ball. Thank you. Bye-bye.